Hello, this is Severus Snape, who is reading to you. Because that's... I need to practice my Severus Snape voice. How about you try? Okay, he's gone shy. Good evening, everybody. My name is Damien from the Tall Friendly Atheist. My name is Damien, the Tall Friendly Atheist Dad from the Tall Friendly Atheist Dad podcast. Hope you're all doing well, and apologies. It's been quite a while between episodes, particularly of this book. Kent Hovind's PhD kind of got in the way. Then a couple of other projects got in the way, and then COVID lockdowns got in the way. And yeah, I've had to just make sure the warm reading sun is coping with lockdown. So far so good, but not without challenges, unfortunately. But anyway, yes. So tonight, it's a bit hard to read when you're if you snuggle my arm, that'll make it a lot easier. But yes, I am in the warm reading bed. Next to me is the warm reading sun, and we are under the warm reading blanket. I am continuing on The Mystery of Acts by Richard Pervo. So unfortunately, we're having a bit of a COVID crisis in Australia at the moment. So I'm just going to move the mic. There you go, it's better. And yeah, so I was trying to think. Yeah, it's been a bit of a worrying time. Just keeping things together, both emotionally and employment-wise, and all that stuff. But anyway, back to the reading. Hopefully, as we start back to the reading cycle, and I'll get a few more episodes out each week, even if it's not as many as before. And yeah, I haven't released my Kent Hovind episodes yet because that's I want that to be a bit of a surprise. I'm actually kind of excited about that. But anyway, yes. So back to The Mystery of Acts, starting at chapter 2, which is called Enigmas of Acts, and this is page 17. And just a word of warning that yes, this is a very wordy book. So yeah. Not much. So you don't make much progress with this one because it's just chock full goodness. Are you ready? Okay, so not from the sleepy reading sun. Love you. Okay, so in this family we say we love each other. Okay, 3, 2, 1. No student can read Acts without dissatisfaction. He would not have written it thus. Why does it end where it ends? Why is there so much space devoted to the account of the storm and shipwreck? Why are St. Paul's trials described in such repetitive detail? Why is so rigorous a subdivision imposed that we hear no more of Philip or Peter when once we have left them, except where their paths cross poles? If we take Acts to be a straightforward history, these questions can only be answered by one of two suppressed hypotheses. The first is that St. Luke was critically short of material, so he wrote all the detail he had heard of or could remember. He did not know what happened subsequently to Paul or Philip or Peter, but he had been much impressed by the shipwreck and the trials. Alternatively, St. Luke was critically short of sense. He could not handle more than one character at a time. The shipwreck was a good story and deserved space. Paul's unhindered preaching at Rome seemed a good place to stop. Both these hypotheses are better suppressed. Not only are they intolerable in themselves, but they lead on to all the notorious historical tangles, which in turn cannot be resolved without making St. Luke more and more ignorant and stupid. The author of this statement, Michael Goulder, believed that Acts was written between 80 to 85 CE by Luke, the companion of Paul. Although I'm convinced that Acts appeared a good generation later, CE 110 to 120, and was written by an admirer rather than a companion of Paul, I quite agree with Goulder's formulation of the problem. Read as history, Acts is unsatisfactory. On a purely superficial level, it is evident, even to one who does not deign to point a questioning finger toward a single reputed fact, that Acts lacks balance. This statement is equally valid whether it is applied to the content of the book or to its structure. The apparent absence of balance suggests, as Goulder indicates, either that the author lacks competence or that the reader is misinterpreting his purpose. The subject of this chapter is enigmas surrounding Acts. In addition to the problems of taking it as straight history, these enigmas include the following. Why write a second volume? Are Luke and Acts two books or one? Should Acts be read in the context of the Gospels or of the epistles? These questions lead to a review of the critical methods applied with considerable success to the Gospels, but not so successfully applied to Acts. The most recent solution has been to read Luke and Acts together without reference to the other Gospels or to the letters. But this option, as noted in the previous chapter, dodges historical questions. For Ernst Haenchen, who did not evade those issues, it gave birth to a two-headed Luke, inept historian, but excellent writer. After a brief introduction to types of narration, key points in the narrative will be scrutinized. An additional problem is the proper conclusion to the statement, Acts is the story of ... Following an examination of issues regarding the structure of the book, the chapter will turn to an old problem: the relation of the Paul of Acts to the Paul of the letters, an issue that leads to a debate about the nature of Lucan theology. Opinions appear and a conclusion is provided, but the chief purpose of this chapter is to identify, rather than resolve, various mysteries and to demonstrate their importance. So I'll try that again. That's better. That's actually, so just skip back to the previous page. There's a saying on there, read as history, Acts is unsatisfactory. And that's quite an interesting thing to say, because Christians and theists and, biblical fundamentalists will go, Luke was the best historian ever. He got so many things right. He got many, all this kind of stuff. I tend to be of the opinion that Luke borrowed from Josephus, which is why he got a lot of things right. And Josephus being the gold standard, one of the best. Josephus was actually probably the best historian in Roman antiquity. So, yeah. And even then, even if you get the historical details right, that's not saying that you get the spiritual details right. And it's a bit like Spider-Man. Spider-Man is set in New York City. And, New York City and all the places in the city of New York, they exist. But that doesn't mean there's a guy in a spider suit who's swinging around playing amateur crime fighter. So, yeah. And yeah, what is the purpose of Acts? That's a question that has evaded evaded a lot of people for a long time, and there are answers, but are those answers satisfactory? Is the real question. But anyway, how you going there? You want to try closing your eyes and relaxing? 3, 2, 1. Why Acts? The first enigma of Acts, crisply stated, is that the book exists. Why did Luke write Acts? Why did this evangelist, alone among the 4, and more when canonical Gospels are taken into account, deem it necessary to continue the story? Merely to raise this question unleashes an unwieldy pack of gremlins. Is Acts really one big book, divided into 2 parts for technological reasons? Recall that, when books were written in rolls, size became a factor, as long rolls were devilishly inconvenient. If, as the content suggests, Luke and Acts were intentionally designed as 2 books, then one must ask if the 2 are of equal importance. Is Acts a supplement to the Gospel of Luke? Or is the Gospel a prelude to the real story? Could the author have achieved the goal of showing that the Gentile mission was legitimate in a single book? The answer to that last question is probably yes. For Matthew achieved much the same in the closing verses of his Gospel, 28:16-20. Luke evidently found it necessary not only to assert the legitimacy of the mission to the Gentiles, but also to tell the story of that mission in some detail. I'm just going to quickly pause for a sec, so give me a second. So I just had to check on something. Yeah, these are interesting points to think about. And this is the thing. Like in our society, writing a 500-page volume on something, is common nowadays. And probably the thickest book I've even picked up, aside from the Bible, the thickest book I picked up was, I think a guy called Paul Ham had written a story about the Vietnam War and Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, and that thing was an absolute doorstop of a book. If I bopped someone over the head with it, it definitely would have caused some damage. But yeah, but having then said that, we know that people like Josephus and I think Tacitus and Suetonius, historians who wrote multi-page, multi-volume, multi-chapter books on the history of Rome. So I think it's weird to say on one hand, Luke was pressed for space and convenience because whereas then on the other hand, we have all these. We have all these historians who managed to write multi-volume chapters, multi-volume works. So yeah. Anyway, back to the 1 book or 2. The question of whether Acts is 1 book or 2 has rarely been explored, for the simple reason that it is a recent question. From roughly the late 2nd century until the early 20th, Luke and Acts were normally studied in different contexts. Then, in the 1920s, a great scholar, Henry J. Cadbury, coined the term Luke Acts to indicate that these 2 consecutive books, written by the same author, should be studied together. The logic of this idea gradually won the day, and today unification is the norm. The term Luke Acts is now the title of choice for the overwhelming majority of English-speaking scholars. Few study Acts today without at least an occasional glance at the Gospel. The two books are closely related, and those who examine one without considering the other do so at their peril. Just quickly, I'm going to mention a brief aside about the field of Gospel studies. It's interesting that, like, to me, it does seem like a very monolithic enterprise. You know, if something go for 1800 years without being questioned, and then all of a sudden you can be you can change minds and all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, like, what else are they holding out on? Are they monolithic because they're trying to hold on to a position? It's And I'm reminded of the example of Thomas L. Thompson, who I forget exactly which university it was, but I think he tried to get a PhD from Tübingen University, and Joseph Ratzinger, who was the head of the studies at the University of Tübingen, actually denied Thomas L. Thompson a PhD because apparently his thesis was on the lack of historicity of Abraham and Moses and Abraham and the patriarchs. And Thomas Thompson went through a lot of hardship because he was denied his PhD. But nowadays, the non-historicity of the patriarchs is something that's generally accepted. So it just makes me wonder that if we can, if certain positions have been held onto for almost 2 millennia, are still present, such as the historicity of Jesus, then it's like, well, I think maybe, and this is what Richard Carrier's book was trying to do, was at least shake up the field. He may not have the open and shut case that people think he's supposed to have or whatever, but but he even writes in his book on the historicity of Jesus that he's not there to give a final answer. He's just there to make a new method and to come up with a different way of looking at the question. But anyway, back to the book. So, the nature of this relationship is different from that between Mark and Matthew, for example, in which Mark constituted a major source of Matthew, or the relationship between Galatians and Romans, which were written by the same author and treat some similar subjects, but were not intended to be compared with one another. Matthew intended to supersede Mark, not to supplement it. Paul wrote Galatians to deal with one set of issues and Romans to deal with another, and any who read both Galatians and Romans in the 50s of the first century might have been left with some questions about the author's integrity. Luke and Acts, on the other hand, belong together. One way to frame the issue is to ask whether Luke wrote the Gospel and Acts to supersede Mark, or just his Gospel to supersede Mark and Acts as a sequel to his Gospel. Strict unification theorists reject the notion that Acts is a sequel. Luke and Acts are a continuous narrative. The implication of this strict unification theory is that Luke has created something entirely novel and unique. For, although we have other Gospels and Acts, for example, the Acts of Paul, no one else has produced a work such as Luke Acts. The logical consequence of this understanding is that Luke is not a Gospel like Matthew, Mark, or John, but rather the first half of a different type of writing. Viewing Luke and Acts as a unified narrative requires the corollary that the combined books represent a single and indeed unique literary genre. If Acts is, on the other hand, a sequel, it is possible that the two represent different genres. The limits of separation are clear. Treating the works as distinct books neglects the similarities between them. The corresponding difficulty is that those who view Luke and Acts as a single work would tend to overlook the differences between them. Since much of what follows stresses these differences, it is apparent that I endorse the hypothesis that Acts is a sequel, but the enigmas of Luke Acts over against Luke and Acts remain. Luke cannot get along without Acts, and I can't get on with it. So, try again. Finger's not working. That's better. Yeah, it is interesting. You know, should Luke and Acts be read separately or together? Well, look, the fact that in the Bible they're separate, and you know that's how it's going to be, and nothing's going to change that. You know, I think it is fair to, because to me they are clearly separate works, and I think you can get clues from cross-referencing them. You okay there? Okay. Yeah, bit of a weird one. Again, why not just write one big long book? But then, hold on. But in the two letters, he does address. I think he does actually address Theophilus twice, but using slightly different titles. But yeah, it is interesting. Anyway, back to the book. How to read Acts 1 with the letters. The third enigma follows from the second. What is one to do with this book? Perhaps the most conventional and convenient approach to the question is that suggested by what is now, but has not always been, the traditional arrangement of the New Testament. Acts does not follow Luke, but John. This permits the four divergent portraits of Jesus to adjoin one another. Then comes Acts. How does it end? With Paul at Rome. Immediately following Acts is the letter of Paul to the Romans. The canonical function of Acts has thus been to serve as a bridge between the story of Jesus and the story of the Church. As a background and preface to the subsequent apostolic epistles. In fact, Acts also plants in the reader's mind a portrait of Paul and a view of Pauline theology and practice. When Acts appears in the company of the epistles, it becomes embroiled in the issues of history, in discussion about the life, teaching, practice, and so forth of Paul. This isolates Acts from the Gospels and places it in the troublesome neighbourhood of the letters. That enigma will receive further attention in this chapter and elsewhere. At present, it need be noted only that when linked with the letters, Acts falls under the shadow of its principal character, Paul, and the accomplishment of Luke comes into collision with Paul's own writings. The more common solutions to this tension are 1. To subordinate the letters to Acts and to incorporate them within its story, and 2. To reject Acts altogether as a valid source for Pauline biography and theology. Critical consensus prefers a compromise between these extremes, such as accepting the data of Acts when its account does not conflict with the primary data of the letters. Can we keep reading? Okay. Alright, almost at the bottom of the page, so I'll read one more page. That'll take us to page 21. And let me see how long this episode's gone for, just to get an idea of the time. Alright, 20 minutes already. Or 24. Okay. Reading Acts 2 with the Gospels. A second approach to the problem of the existence of Acts is to align the book more closely with the Gospels, especially that of Luke. When this is done, discussions revolve around the application of various critical methods. For roughly a century, 1875 to 1975, study of the New Testament narratives followed a logical course. The first requirement was the establishment of a critical text, because the various manuscripts of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, contain a goodly amount of contamination, in particular the introduction of material from Matthew into Mark and Luke. With a good text derived from superior manuscripts and sharpened method, it became possible to attack the source question. After investigation established that Mark, although the earliest, was not a trustworthy source for the life of the historical Jesus, because its structure was determined by theological rather than by biographical concerns, scholarship turned to the constituent units of the gospel tradition, the origin and evolution of the individual stories, anecdotes, and other passages. This discipline, called form criticism, indicated that the various units that comprise the Synoptic Gospels had been forged in the workshops of various communities, and that they were told for the purposes of instruction, edification, worship, and justification of the practices and beliefs of the early Jesus movements. Form criticism demonstrated that these passages, pericopes, had evolved, and that it was possible to get behind the gospel accounts to earlier stages of the tradition. This sort of gospel form criticism flourished between the two world wars. After 1945, a new discipline emerged, redaction criticism, the study of how writers use their sources, assumed the results of source criticism and returned attention to the actual text rather than to its presumed oral and written prehistory. For source critics, the evangelists were skilled in the use of scissors and paste. The less they tampered with their sources, the more helpful they were to the critic, whose task of disentangling one source from another was thereby facilitated. Form criticism, on the other hand, looked behind the detectable sources to the process of assembly. For this method, the synoptic tradition was the product of collectors who gathered and arranged disparate materials. Collections were frequently arranged by subject, as can be seen in the grouped pronouncement stories in Mark 2:1 to 3:6, or the parables of Mark 4:1 to 34, as well as in cycles of miracle stories behind Mark 4:35 to 8:10. Redaction criticism recognized the role of the evangelists as editors. Rather than be content with compiling and ordering source materials, the several evangelists had edited them by placement and alteration to accommodate their own particular views. A useful means for discovering what Matthew and Luke were about to was observe how they had altered or supplemented Mark and their other major source, Q. Redaction criticism made it possible to speak of the theology of Matthew and the theology of Luke. The latter phrase furnished the English title for a major contribution of Hans Conzelmann, a German scholar who brought editorial activity to the centre of gospel studies. In the case of Mark and John, however, redaction criticism is more difficult, for one must first reconstruct the source from the text itself, and then attempt to show how it was altered. This problem provides a good opportunity for returning to the subject of Acts, since form criticism also depends upon editorial analysis of the conventions peculiar to the various types. If, for example, an account of the story of Cinderella introduced a fourth sister who railed against the idea of finding a Prince Charming as the chief object of female life, and denounced high-heeled glass slippers as utterly impractical footwear, the reader would regard that sibling as an interpolation introduced by a critic of social convention. Everyone senses the propriety of the rule of three, and even those who do not know the story of Cinderella, but have some familiarity with fairy tales, will perceive that the additional sister does not fit. Form criticism looks for items that do not fit, with particular attention to the pre-gospel tradition. Redaction criticism does the same, with particular attention to anomalies that appear to suit the individual evangelists rather than his predecessors. For an example of the latter, one may observe how Matthew 9:17 and Luke 5:39 expand Mark 2:18-22. To put it form critically, these changes are examples of how pronouncement stories attract additional sayings. From the redaction critical perspective, they illustrate how the other evangelists alter Mark to suit their own viewpoints. In Mark 2:18, new views require fresh methods and practices. The old is outdated. Matthew wishes to preserve both the old and the new. Counter Matthew 13:52. Luke revises the proposal. The old is superior. The Jesus movement fulfills the ancient promises and prophecy. Both Matthew and Luke thus preserve a saying of Jesus in Mark, with which they do not fully agree. Supplementation is one means for altering a sentiment. And just on that page, there is a table called Redaction Criticism, and it lists three verses, which I'll quickly read. So one column is Mark 2:22d, but one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. In the middle column is Matthew 9:17, E to F, but new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved. And then the last column is Luke 5:38-39. But new wine must be put in the fresh wineskins, and no one after drinking old wine desires new wine, but says the old is good. This is all the stuff that I missed out on when I was a fundamentalist. You know, all the scholarship and the different historiocritical methods and the different ways of looking at it. Because in fundamentalist land, the book is the literal truth, and don't you dare find anything wrong with it. It's just interesting. I think redaction criticism is probably the best. But that's just that's just me. But it is just interesting that you can actually find how different sources did different things differently. I don't accept the Q hypothesis, but that's only mostly because we don't have a Q. And then that's why it's called the Q hypothesis. But anyone who hangs their hat on Q is a fool. But anyway, so we're now up to page 23 of The Mystery of Acts. The next section is titled Acts and Critical Methods. And I'll end the reading here. Hope you've enjoyed it. Until next time, look after yourselves. Stay safe. Don't do something to get yourself infected and all that kind of stuff. But otherwise, look after yourself. Stay mentally and physically healthy. See ya.